You must be some kind of nerd to watch a Zelda timeline video this long. Me too. This video is so long, I've created some time codes to help you navigate the video. We have the actual timeline itself, as well as before that, some rules on creating your own timeline if you're thinking of making one. And before that, an explainer about where I'm coming from and the Hyrule Historia and why I don't like it. So let's start with the passage within the Hyrule Historia that actually makes it debunk itself. Enjoy.
The weaving of history. This chronicle merely collects information that is believed to be true at this time, and there are many obscured and unanswered secrets that still lie within this tale. As the stories and storytellers of Hyrule change, so too does its history. Hyrule's history is a continuously woven tapestry of events. Changes that seem inconsequential, disregarded without even a shrug, could evolve at some point to hatch new legends, and perhaps change this tapestry of history itself. Or in other words, Hyrule historians, the histories of Hyrule as we know them, the information within these books, are possibly wrong. My very own Zelda timeline video. Before I had Birdkeeper and made a channel all about Pokemon, I had a Zelda channel, the Wind Waker 94, and the first video I did was my take on the Zelda timeline, a timeline I had come up with before the Hyrule Historia even existed. And when it came out, this is the canon timeline with its multiple splits. The fun was ruined. And I stopped making Zelda content. I started making Pokemon content instead, because to me, the idea of theorizing and thinking and coming up with your own canon, that excited me. But the Hyrule Historia's interpretation of the timeline has not only changed over time, it's been blown out of the water with evidence that exists in Breath of the Wild. While there are many videos talking about how the Hyrule Historia is wrong, or Banded Games did one just 4 weeks ago on why it's absolutely impossible, and I'm sure I could add my voice to the choir and bring in plenty more points, that's not what this video is about, because realistically, my own Zelda timeline, my interpretation of the history of Hyrule as a Hyrulean adventurer and storyteller myself, also probably has flaws. I have no doubt that there will be many of you who will watch this Zelda timeline and think that's ridiculous, Toby. But what I encourage you to do is to instead come up with your own timeline in the comments down below. If you think there's something wrong about the way that I've stitched together and weaved together this tale of history, let me know. How would you have done it different? That's what I want to see. That's what this has all been about. This is probably my last Zelda video for a while, but maybe closer to the release of Breath of the Wild 2, as I still know it to be called at this time. I suspect by the time this video comes out, it'll actually have a name. This is probably going to be my last Zelda video until about then, but this timeline is huge because it actually stitches in all of the prior theories that I've done into the timeline. So there's a lot of building I've already been doing. And if you are going to build your Zelda timeline like me, then you need to accept the 10 rules that no matter where you sit in Hyrule's history are probably always true, that are always the case. Yes, it's all open to interpretation, of course, but some games have information that literally declare that the games precede or come after one another. So here are my 10 rules for building a Zelda timeline that I think are pretty much guaranteed. Number 1, the game Legend of Zelda: The Spirit Tracks follows Phantom Hourglass, which follows Wind Waker, which follows Ocarina of Time. The distance of time between these games, or whether there's other games in between them, I don't know, but the rule is Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks. That is rule number 1. Rule number 2, it would seem to be the case that Twilight Princess is definitely after Majora's Mask at some point, which is also definitely after Ocarina of Time. Rule number 3, Skyward Sword is first in the timeline. I don't think anyone disputes that anymore, and I think that's pretty much solid fact. Rule number 4, Minish Cap is before Four Swords, which is before Four Swords Adventures. Number 5, The Legend of Zelda is followed by Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. The one game comes after the other. It might seem obvious, but yeah, it's not. And all we're doing here, by the way, is we're taking the nearly 20 games throughout Zelda's history and stitching them together into bigger blocks so that we don't have to deal with every individual game. It should be obvious. Zelda 2 comes after Zelda 1. You know? Well, I don't know, maybe you've got a different theory and I'd love to hear it. Number 6, and the reason that Breath of the Wild destroys most timelines, is it definitely happens after Skyward Sword, Majora's Mask, Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, possibly Link's Awakening, and Phantom Hourglass, depending on if you count the canonicity of the whale skeletons as being the actual whales from those games. The point is that every timeline has a little bit of something that appears in this game, and this game appears after at least all of those games. Number 7, A Link to the Past, Oracle of Ages and Seasons, and Link's Awakening are all followed. They're like, it's A Link to the Past first, definitely. I'm pretty sure it's Oracle of Ages and Seasons and then Link's Awakening, but I know the canon, they've swapped it over a couple times. And then eventually down that line, you also have A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes. That should have been a Four Swords game, really, but I guess they didn't want a fourth person in it. Number 8, Breath of the Wild 2 happens after, guess what, Breath of the Wild. And number 9, and I guess this is technically the final rule, I thought maybe there'd be 10 because 10 is a nice round number, but 9th rule, what you choose to be canon is actually relatively subjective. It's a grey line that you have to draw. Think about it. I'm saying that the Hyrule Historia isn't canon, something that claims itself to be canon, or that the canon of it is questionable. Do you count the guidebooks that come with the games? Heck, do you count Easter eggs that appear in the games? What about re-releases of old games? In The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, we see the Tingle Tuner, but in Zelda The Wind Waker HD, we see the Miiverse bottle. Is the Miiverse bottle more canon than the Tingle Tuner? Or given that they're about additional features that are more to do with the game's connectivity, are they canon at all? Does something that looks like a Game Boy Advance appear in the Zelda world? Does Zelda know what a Mii is? Heck, even down to the re-release of A Link to the Past on Game Boy Advance featuring a whole new dungeon, the Dungeon of the Four Sword, which is a reference to the Four Swords Adventure mode that comes packaged with the game. Here, I don't think that Temple of the Four Sword is meant to be canon, but if you want to count it as canon, that is really up to you. All I'm saying is, while I wouldn't deny that there is a character called Link who appears in each of these games, shocker, there are certain details that are up to you, the Hyrule historian telling the story, to decide and just tell us what you think is and isn't canon when you're constructing your timeline. Like personally, all the DLC items that appear in Breath of the Wild, that's not canon to me, but maybe it is to you, and that's okay. Again, you could say the game creators have said X, Y, or Z is canon, but I don't know that I count what the game creators have said. I don't count what the game creators have said as canon. That's the point of theorizing. But I do count the majority of things that actually appear in the games. As to which version of the games, the latest release, the original release, I guess that's a very case-by-case kind of basis. Anyway, I've been preambling long enough. Let's get on with my Zelda timeline. Starting with, of course, that rule that I said, Skyward Sword. It comes first. Quick overview of Skyward Sword. You know the deal generally. The world was created by the 3 golden goddesses. There is another goddess called Hylia who reincarnates as the human Princess Zelda. Zelda chooses a hero, that becomes you, Link, to fight against the demon horde that's coming from under the earth, led by Demise, a character who looks like Ganondorf, because guess what? He is responsible for the curse that will fuel Ganondorf throughout the ages. These 3 characters, Link, Zelda, and Ganon, are always going to reincarnate or repower up somewhere along the timeline. I am of the belief that there are multiple Zeldas. Of course, I don't think that's unique, but they all embody the spirit of Hylia. Link, there are multiple Links that all embody the spirit of the hero, and multiple Links can even exist at the same time. Yes, that is going to be important later, but Ganondorf, I'm up for debate as to whether there's just the one that we've seen throughout all of history, that powerful, fueled by Demise's curse, or whether there's multiple. It really depends on how you reconcile certain dialogue in Four Swords Adventures. And other than that, that's pretty much it. This is the fight of Zelda and Link against evil throughout the ages. Not counting Wand of Gamelon, by the way. Obviously, why would that's not a thing. Okay, Skyward Sword at the beginning, that much is pretty much obvious. Then followed by Ocarina of Time. Based on the rules, Ocarina of Time preceding Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, Breath of the Wild, it precedes a lot of games, and I think it is supposed to be early on. It's really a defining, moment in Zelda history. The story of the hero of time, it affects so many other stories. I think it's quite an early one, and in this one we see Ganondorf actually surprisingly not brute forcing his way through Hyrule Kingdom, but instead trying a more diplomatic / Littlefinger-esque kind of approach where he's going to weave his way up through power. Of course, you and Zelda know he's up to something. Zelda's had a prophetic dream, and you go about your adventure to stop him. You open up the Sacred Realm, and it may be at that point that actually Demise's curse enters him. He may not be the result of Demise's curse until that point, may genuinely just be the ruler of the Gerudo. Anyway, that's up for you to decide. He rules Hyrule for 7 years with an iron fist until the hero reawakens and has to go about awakening the sages, many of the characters he's met along his journey, and then he manages, with the help of Zelda, to stop Ganondorf. He, for the first time, transforms into Ganon, the beast of evil. Ganon and Ganondorf are the same creature, just in 2 different forms. He can shapeshift between these 2 versions of himself, the powerful wizard and the enraged beast. What this means to me is later on, when Ganon appears in the timeline, but we don't see Ganondorf the human, The human still exists. He's in there somewhere. Ganon can revert in and out of these forms. We see this in Twilight Princess directly, in which he's the beast version of Ganon first, and then he turns into Ganondorf the human after, who you have to fight in a sword battle. Fight in a sword battle? Battle in a sword fight. Sounds better. Right. Ocarina of Time happens, and then this is the controversial bit that I don't think I've mentioned up until this point. No splits. No timeline splits. But time travel's in this game. And Toby, the opening to Zelda the Wind Waker, what are you talking about? What sacrilege is this? Yeah, okay, here's the thing. There's time travel in Skyward Sword and like a number of other Zelda games, and we don't put timeline splits there just in the same way that we don't do, oh, if you get a game over in this game or that game. I'm not doing any splits, not just the downfall timeline, none of it. Child-adult split. I think that the Zelda timeline accounts for, in my version of it, a pretty linear history from one game right down to the bottom. It just makes sense to me as one story, and if you start adding in timeline splits, I don't see why Ocarina of Time is the exception just because it's got time in the name. Again, time travel happens in Skyward Sword. There should have been other timeline splits in different places, and I think the opening to the Wind Waker and like Wind Waker and Majora's Mask both being sequels to Ocarina of Time can still work in a linear timeline.
In fact, if you believe Tingle's recounting of the events of Majora's Mask in the Tower of the Gods to be canon, then it may in fact be necessary for Wind Waker and Majora's Mask to exist in the same timeline.
So here we go. This is what I think happens. Zelda sends Link back in time. Now that future Hyrule where everything all went wrong, it happened, but that future is now destroyed. It's gone, it's over, it's done with. Link returns to the main timeline that we're going to follow, this childhood timeline if you like. This is the true Hyrule that we're following for the rest of the adventure. Zelda says, Link, you should go live out your childhood. And he's like, I'm gonna go find my fairy friend Navi, and heads for the Lost Woods. He goes to the Lost Woods and stumbles and falls and ends up in Termina. Then Majora's Mask happens, and that's fine, we know all about that. The world of Majora's Mask is set though in Termina, and Termina is different to Hyrule. A different realm, something that's happening in Link's head. The official canon can't even agree, changing its mind over time. Is it another country? It certainly seems physically connected to Hyrule, but is there some magic about its presence? Are the people in that world actually parallel versions of the characters who appear in Hyrule? Or are we just trying to explain away early Nintendo 64 graphics and a deadline to reuse a lot of assets in game creation? These are questions that I'm not 100% sure I know the answer to, but I think there is some magic about the world of Termina that insulates it from the rest of Hyrule, but there is also a physical connection point. Like, the people of Termina, I believe, know about the people of Hyrule. I think there is and has been commerce and travel between those two locations, but again, there is some magic about the whole thing, which is normal in a world filled with magic and dragons and sorcerers. That just lines up. Fine, so Link and the bloodline of the original hero, the hero of time, ends up in Termina. So what's happening in Hyrule in the meantime? Well, Princess Zelda has told her dad, hey, that Ganondorf guy, the guy sitting on your small council, he's kind of a bad guy. I think, you know, if he gets his way, he'll take over. I've seen it, and her father believes her. He banishes Ganondorf back to the Gerudo Desert, and at this point, Ganondorf is like, no, no, no. I have to take the Sacred Realm by force. And so he and his Gerudo followers, the majority of them, leave the Gerudo Desert and come to invade Hyrule. They will later be known down the line as interlopers. They will be known as people who are trying to go for this sacred power that they are forbade from touching. And they nearly achieve this, but Zelda knows other information from the future. She knows about the sages. She knows about who will become the sages, and so the 7 sages help her stop Ganondorf and seal him away. This is the pre-story to A Link to the Past. Ganondorf is sealed away inside the Sacred Realm, but Ganondorf is powerful and always returns, and so a part of his soul in the character of Aghanim escapes and starts seeding evil throughout the castle until eventually the events of A Link to the Past happen. Zelda, of that age, calls out to A Link to help her find the 7 maidens who are the descendants of the sages from Ocarina of Time in the pre-story to A Link to the Past. And that Link is like, hey, I think you've got the wrong number. Who are you? Because this is not the Link that's even a descendant of the one from Majora's Mask. This Link has no idea who Zelda is. It's a different hero at a different time, and we know different bloodlines of the hero can exist because we know there's Link that will appear in Wind Waker later on shares no blood relation with the Link from Ocarina of Time. The gods always want there to be one Link in Hyrule at all times. So where is the original bloodline of the Link? Well, we'll get to that in just a moment, but first we have Oracle of Ages and Seasons and then Link's Awakening that happen after A Link to the Past in the more immediate future for that Link. But they're relatively self-contained stories. It is important to note though, that aided by someone who's dressed like an Iron Knuckle and someone that looks like a Twilight, the Gerudo Twin Rover try to revive the beast form of Ganon, but they only really get back his bestial form. But again, human is in there somewhere, and Link manages to stop him. Now, at this point, Link goes off and does the adventures of Link's Awakening, where he remembers the nightmare version of Ganon who appears in that game. Link's Awakening, super self-contained, whatever, no biggie. At this point, the 7 sages, the descendants of the maidens, the descendants of the sages, this generation's version of the sages decide, man, this Ganondorf guy, he keeps coming back. Now, we've sealed away his followers, at first in the Sacred Realm, and then we've moved them to this Twilight Realm. But even then, one of them, Viran, the character from Oracle of Ages and Seasons, did manage to help him escape. Ganondorf is gonna keep coming back. We need to execute the wizard. We need to execute the human form of Ganondorf. This is the flashback sequence that we see in Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess happening after A Link to the Past, Oracle of Ages and Seasons, and Link's Awakening. This is what's happening in Hyrule. There is no hero in Hyrule at this point. Perhaps the one from Link's Awakening is too old, or maybe he ended up drifting away, lost at sea. The other Link, the one of Termina, he's still out there somewhere. You might be able to see where this is going, but Ganondorf is executed, but by some divine prank, he still has the Triforce of Power and is able to manipulate his own followers in the Twilight Realm and eventually rally an army against Midna and escape, causing the invasion once again of the Light World through his puppeteering of Zant. Okay, so what about Link? Where does the Link from Twilight Princess come in? Well, he's on a ranch town that appears in the Ordana province. Now, the Ordana province doesn't really appear anywhere else in previous Zelda titles. In fact, it's kind of weird, because in previous Zelda titles, there's always the 3 dragons, the 3 goddesses, the 3 oracles, Din, Nehru, Faeror, Farosh, Eldin, Naedra, there's always this set of 3. But in Twilight Princess, there's a 4th. There's Ordana, this totally other deity. And at the beginning of the game, Russ says to Link, hey, you've never been to Hyrule before, have you? Implying that Hyrule, the country, the area, the realm, is separate from Ordana. This is, in my belief, a sign that the Ordana province is actually part of Termina, perhaps what was once the Romani Ranch, where Romani and Link eventually hooked up and their kid becomes a farmer's aide on that ranch. Of course, the hero of time himself would go on to become the hero Shade, who would help Link throughout his adventures after returning to Hyrule. And again, to get from Ordana to Hyrule, you need to go through the wooded area, the Lost Woods. Bam, and that is where Twilight Princess happens. And of course, at the end of the game, Ganondorf is stabbed through the chest. Man, that guy is dead, right? Except we now know for a fact, it doesn't matter how dead you think Ganondorf is, he's always coming back. Always, always coming back. That guy's a mummy! He's coming back! It doesn't matter if you stab him through the heart, the head, whatever. He is fueled by the Demon King. He'll always return. So, stabbed through the chest, Ganondorf is dead for now. However, he will, as he always does, return at some point later on. This is where the event of A Link Between the Worlds happens a little further down the line, following the descendant of the hero from Link's Awakening. And eventually, Triforce Heroes, if you need to count that as canon. I'm not going to cover any more about Triforce Heroes. I'll be honest, I've not played it. It's the one that I definitely haven't played. And then peace sweeps across the realm. Until eventually, as always, it doesn't. And we get the pre-story to The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker. Now, of all of these times, of all of these legends and stories, the one that is the most solidified in the history of Hyrule is that initial battle. Link awakening the sages and saving Hyrule, memorialized in great tapestries and statues that appear in Zelda the Wind Waker. You might think, well, that's got to be the adult timeline, because we see the adult version of the sages, but the sages from those games do grow up anyway. The legend, this story of a hero who traveled through time to save the day, is passed down by Zelda and her descendants. It is important to chronicle the history that never was, and as always, the evil that is Ganondorf creeps back into the world. The hero of Twilight Princess, where did he and his descendants go? We don't know. Riding off into the distance somewhere on Epona's back. The hero of Triforce Heroes, I guess they were off in Hytopia, dressing up differently. I don't know. And so, once again, Ganondorf creeps back into the world, first as his bestial form and eventually returning to the form of the wizard, the man who remembers his history, his time as a Gerudo human. He establishes a base at the Forsaken Fortress, and we get the events of Zelda the Wind Waker, my favourite Zelda title. I love it. Followed, of course, by, again, two relatively obscure stories, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. Spirit Tracks happens in New Hyrule. I believe this is just yet another country further off from Hyrule. Heck, could be Termina for all I know. I don't really care. There's many countries out there, or realms or areas around Hyrule. That doesn't matter. These are side stories. It is, however, possible, though, that the demon that appears in Spirit Tracks could be part of Ganon's energy, as they are referred to as a Demon King, but the world of the original Hyrule at this point has been flooded. But we know from Breath of the Wild that 10,000 years later, the world will be unflooded. The salt rock that's absolutely everywhere, the Koroks, and all the other various connections to Zelda the Wind Waker. Yeah, I truly believe that the Sky Islands that we're going to visit in Breath of the Wild Part 2 are just the regular islands of the world of the Wind Waker, but the floods recede and Hyrule is returned to the people, and then 10,000 years pass. And yeah, we're not through every Zelda game yet. I don't think Breath of the Wild is the last game in the Zelda timeline. But at this point, what was Ganon? What was that creature? The Calamity? And I guess you could include the Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity game here if you wanted. But that story and that transformation of the character over time, a lot of it has been relegated to the Age of Legend. No one really remembers where Ganondorf comes from. There's talk about the fact that he might have once been a Gerudo. There are relics of the past. There are also the introductions of new locations like Mount Colonel that'll be appearing a little bit later on and featuring more prominently. But yeah, Hyrule is changing and shifting a lot. And then, of course, after Breath of the Wild will be Breath of the Wild 2 with whatever the story takes us for that. Now, at this point in the timeline, I have just 5 games left. And I want to talk about a couple of the theories that I've done on this channel before that tie into this. I think this lines up really well with the theory that I've done about the Gerudo being the Twilight. I think this timeline works really well with the idea that the Minish that I'm about to talk about were once the Uka, which were once the Loftwings, a race really close to the gods that came from a realm in the sky. I'm sure we'll learn more about them in Breath of the Wild Part 2. I think most of the developments of the various races and connections line up pretty well here with the Kokiri turning into the Koroks and all of that jazz. It all makes sense to me so far. But the ages continue to pass. Hyrule continues to change and shift, and we know that over 10,000 years it goes from medieval to looking medieval. This is just the state of being in the world of Hyrule. I guess so many calamities by Ganon and so many invasions by forces of evil ultimately mean that the world could never really progress past the Middle Ages look. And so we have the events of Minish Cap set in a Hyrule, yes, after Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild 2, which tells the story of the sword that came from the sky, the Master Sword from Skyward Sword, at this point in history called the Picori Blade, being absolutely destroyed at the beginning of the game and reforged into the Four Sword, because the thing you might notice is that Four Swords Adventures, Legend of Zelda, and Legend of Zelda 2, none of them feature the Master Sword, because at this point in the timeline, it's been destroyed and been completely replaced.
Possibly it was damaged after the events of Tears of the Kingdom, which is why we only see the top half of the blade in the chest in Minish Cap.
And at this point, the rest of the timeline is pretty self-explanatory. Minish Cap is followed by Four Swords, then Four Swords Adventures, then many generations later, Legend of Zelda, and then Legend of Zelda 2. I believe that the name change of the Picori from Blade from the Master Sword and the Light Force from the Triforce, these are just reflections of the fact that the legends have passed on. It has been over 10,000 years, and then probably more some since Breath of the Wild to Minish Cap. Furthermore, these relics then re-obtaining the name, for example, the Triforce and the Light Force. First of all, they weren't that different to begin with, but the discovery of a single scroll can explain these things. Now, I like this timeline. I see a lot of things that can now make sense that didn't make sense with the Hyrule Historia version. For example, Tingle's message appearing in the Towers of God. However, maybe you just excuse that as a little bit of an Easter egg. And the Tingle Tuner, it's not really canon. And the message of the hero, it's not canon. Maybe there are things in this timeline. In fact, I guarantee there are things in this timeline that if you're a Zelda fan, that just sound wrong to you. This is the canon by which I enjoy the games. That's it. I'm not saying it's the right timeline because I don't believe the right timeline exists. I believe these games were developed in a way where the game developer's relationship to the timeline has changed itself over time. I believe those words were put in the Hyrule Historia to allow them for flexibility. I believe Breath of the Wild was created in the way it did. It was to provide for flexibility. And I also believe that the games are called The Legend of Zelda. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think the point is that these are legends and that certain details are meant to be ambiguous. Does Beedle, for example, the shopkeep, is it the same one throughout history? Is it a family lineage? What about the different people that appear in Termina from the ones that look exactly the same that appear in Hyrule? Are they parallel versions or is it just a game mechanic? What about Tingle, who appears throughout the timeline? Is it possible that Tingle really is a time god? These are the fun things that we get to speculate about and think about when we think about the timeline however we want. So I would love to see in the comments down below, what are your timelines? What are the reasons that this timeline could be impossible? Sure, but what are your timelines and how do you think they fix the problems of this one or the Hyrule Historia? I would love to know. It's been really fun to get to share this with you. And I'll be honest, like this timeline has changed from where it was when I first made it. When I first made my Zelda timeline just before the Hyrule Historia came out, there actually was a timeline split with Wind Waker, but I've decided I just don't think that's necessary anymore. So yeah, this is it. My Zelda timeline. Thank you all for listening. And of course, so hi Hyrule Historians. Don't know why I did that. That's not a thing I do.
Wow! Yay! Hop! Yup!
A huge thank you to those of you supporting both this channel and Cardkeeper Toby through Patreon. A huge shout out to the big patrons of the month, Jed Rubin, Michael Hornchew, Elite Trainer Kenway, and the Elgator. Thank you.